Hello everybody and welcome to the latest in the Chango mini webinar series. Our title today is Exposing Display Media Measurement. We call this series the mini webinar series on purpose. We respect and understand your time is short and we like to get you on and off the call in about 30 minutes. I'm going to talk for about 15 to 20 minutes with content, and then at the end we will tackle your questions, of which thank you to those of you who've already submitted some to us through the chat interface and also over Twitter as well. Down in the bottom left-hand corner of your interface, you will see a chat and questions box. Please feel free to use that throughout the presentation, but we'll tackle those questions at the very end and make sure we get to all of those, or certainly as many as we can. At the 30-minute mark, then feel free, obviously, to drop off from the webinar. We will stay on the line a little bit longer to answer any other questions that come in, but you'll certainly be on and off with the main portion of the content in under 30 minutes. My name is Dax Hamman, Chief Strategy and Revenue Officer here at Chango, and we'll talk a little bit more about Chango briefly in just a moment. This topic of display media measurement, view-through, attribution, and so on, is something I'm very passionate about. For those of you who have attended our previous webinars, who've downloaded our white papers or read our articles, you'll know that it's a topic we write about peripherally, and we do a lot of events and meetings with our clients and partners and so on the subject. And looking at the registration numbers for this particular webinar, then it currently is standing as our second most popular webinar, and so certainly the rest of you have a real interest in this subject. What I want to do today is take a very unbiased view to display media measurement. We're first of all going to explain what the problem is, how people are currently looking at it. We are going to talk about post-impression and view-through. We're going to talk about, first of all, why marketers are skeptical, and then we're going to look at the reasons why we believe view-through is a valid metric. But we're not going to leave it there. We're also going to talk about the fundamental problem created by the tracking of site retargeting in particular, and how it skews marketers' opinions and causes a significant number of problems. So that kind of leads us on to really why we're here. Bad data causes marketers to make bad decisions. And at the moment, when I go talk to clients and agency partners, we see a lot of people measuring display media inaccurately, and therefore are making inaccurate decisions about where they should allocate their spend and the performance of certain types of tactics. We've become very heavily focused as an industry on this idea that the click is the be-all and end-all. And in part, that problem's been created by technologies that have been with us almost since the beginning of display media, such as the ad servers or on-site analytic packages that are entirely focused on this idea of last touch is the be-all and end-all, and even worse, last click is the be-all and end-all. And so today we're going to give you the data you need to understand the arguments for and against, and allow you to formulate your own point of view, but also give you some real-life practical methods for tracking display media in a more accurate manner. So a very brief comment, first of all, about Chango so you understand where we're coming from. Our mission in life is to help marketers solve their digital needs. And we do this in a number of ways. We're very focused on this world of programmatic and big data, and I know they're terrible buzz terms, and you can't really read any industry publication today without seeing those terms be listed somewhere. So let's quickly demystify those. Big data simply means lots and lots of data in lots and lots of different places. And by its nature, it can be difficult to use because it's all over the place. Well, programmatic is simply the glue, if you will, that brings all that big data or more data back together. We have this incredible arrogance in our industry of assuming that we've created everything. And I wouldn't dare dream of walking into a major retailer that's been in business for decades and decades and start talking about, for instance, how suddenly there's this thing called big data. Crikey, these organizations have had big data longer than our industry has existed. And so, we have to be realistic and understand what those things are. Big data is just lots of data. Programmatic is the glue to bring it together and make it actionable. And that's the world in which Chango was built for, and that's the way we help our clients solve problems. And for most of you on this call, as I look through the attendee list, you particularly know us for our full-service media solutions, and they fall into two buckets: prospecting for brand new customers and converting your existing customers or visitors. We're particularly well known for creating this idea of search retargeting, the idea that you can find individuals who are searching on Google, Yahoo, Bing, but who have not responded or interacted with your brand. We can serve display ads to those people, and we're uniquely positioned in that we're the second largest source of search data in the US, UK, and Canada, and actually have more search data going through our system every month than Yahoo and Bing combined. So it gives us this tremendous breadth and depth. And then more lately, we're known for flipping this idea of site retargeting on its head and driving efficiencies, quite frankly, in places that a lot of people haven't looked. Many of you on the call are also our technology partners and know us as the higher infrastructure layer that powers your programmatic solution. If you're interested in any more of this, then feel free to swing by to chango.com and you can read about those solutions. And you can get in touch with me, Dax, D-A-X, at chango.com, or you can reach out through sales@chango.com as well. We have experienced significant growth by playing in this programmatic world, 600% year-over-year. Was our year last year, and it's tracking that way now. And we also have 9 offices, real offices with real people in them. And so we'll help you in the US, Canada, and the UK from a local market. So that's enough about Chango for the time being. For those of you that have just dialed in, quick reminder, bottom left-hand corner, chat and question function. Feel free to fire those over at any time during the presentation, and we will get to those at the end. So let's importantly deal with the basics. What is post-click? What is post-impression? Post-click is when somebody is exposed to your advertising, they click on that advertising, and then they visit your site. A post-click conversion is when a conversion took place. A post-click event is when they clicked and did something else, perhaps without reaching that conversion point. As simple as that. Now, post-impression, as an industry, we've decided to make this extremely difficult and confusing for ourselves. Post-impression also means view-through. And it also has been called various things. You'll often see the acronym VT, conversion, for instance, to view through. Post-impression, view through, it all means the same thing. It is when somebody was exposed to your advertising, did not click on it, yet still went on and visited your site or reached the conversion point. Simply put, that's what post-impression or view through is. And why does it matter? Well, within the display world, 90% of all conversions typically occur from view-through. People were exposed to the campaign and did something. And only 10% occur from after a click has taken place. And so you can't ignore the 90% conversion. Sure, there is questions over how valid they are, and we'll come on to that as a moment. But you can't simply ignore that 90% and turn a blind eye to it, because it is the significant bulk of the conversions that are taking place. There's several arguments why marketers are skeptical about view-through. First of all, there's a lot of people I see dialed into this call who I know come from the search world. You have a very concrete line of measurement. You ran your SEM ad, someone did their search, they put up their hand and said, "Hi, I'm looking for a hotel in San Francisco." They saw your SEM ad, they clicked, and they booked. Very simple, very attributable, very straightforward. The trouble is display media advertising simply doesn't work that way. So that's one problem. The second problem is this idea of a tracking window. The tracking window problem is that when we first started building tools like ad servers, like DoubleClick and Atlas, they were pioneers. They didn't necessarily know, obviously, how this industry was going to net out. And they built defaults into their systems that have become adapted as the standard way at which marketers look at display advertising. One of those defaults is that the tracking window is set often to 30 days. That's fine. Sorry, we're getting a couple of comments through that there seems to be some background noise occurring on our end. We have somebody, I can't hear it particularly loud on this end, but for those of you that can, our apologies. I do have somebody who is going to go shout at the neighbors, so we will deal with that as quickly as we can. So this tracking window is this problem. That people think that by default you should look at what happens for a whole 30 days after the ad was actually shown to an individual. Well, if you're selling mortgages, perhaps that's okay. It's a very long consideration cycle. And there are arguments that say 30 days is okay. But if you're selling a book, if you're selling a DVD, then chances are somebody is not going to sit around and wait 30 days before they make their decision as to whether they buy. And so a window of maybe 1 day, 2 days, 3 days is a much more realistic number to be using. And so typically we will advise clients to start at 14 days instead of 30 days, but then we'll help them do studies to understand whether even 14 days is too much or too little. It's funny, thank you to the people commenting that they can hear footsteps. And I am sorry about the noise. We're not hearing it on our end at all, and the lines are muted. Somebody is looking into the technical side of it to see if we can address that in any way. So let's continue, and hopefully that background noise issue will solve itself, and we'll see what occurs. So the other argument, particularly against view-through, which is very unfortunate, is that our industry was subject to a tremendous amount of fraud in the early days. There's this concept of cookie stuffing. Now, cookie stuffing is a funny term, but if you think about that, if you think about the fact that we track the view-through by dropping a cookie on someone's computer and then following them around to see if they actually came and converted, then what a publisher could do in the past is they could go across the web and they could scatter as many cookies as they could simply by serving junk ads all over the place and getting their pixel in front of as many people. And you can imagine that if you managed to drop a cookie on all 220 million online Americans, then you could claim view-through artificially for pretty much everybody. That used to occur a lot in the early days of the web. Now, thankfully, if you work with reputable partners like Chango, this is simply a thing of the past and has been eliminated. But you do still have to be careful. There are cases that I've seen very recently where certain affiliate networks, certain overseas publishers that have become popular are still doing this on an occasional basis. And of course, it skews the data and makes people skeptical about that idea of view-through. Thankfully, as I say, fraud is starting to become a thing of the past within our industry. So with all these things occurring, I totally understand why marketers have skepticism about view-through. But then there's many arguments for why view-through is a valid metric, and I want to counter with those. First of all, we have to give a nod to traditional advertising. Outdoor advertising, radio, TV, newspaper, magazine. This stuff works and has worked for decades. Otherwise, why would so many of these companies continue to advertise them? Those of you that have experience working in a traditional world, then you're fully aware of the methodologies. For tracking traditional advertising. Those of you that don't, there's certainly a lot of information out there that you can go read. But I think it's safe for us to say that given the amount of spend that continues to be spent in traditional, it clearly has some value for those marketers. And so what this tells us is exposing somebody to a brand message has an influence on that individual. And that is exactly what's happening within display as well. The second thing we should look at is who are the responders, whether it be from a post-click or a post-impression point of view. There's a number of studies. One that I like was done by ComScore. It's called Wither the Click. And Wither the Click says that the vast majority of clicks online come from a very few number of people. And often the people who are clicking on the advertising are the youngest of the demographic, the oldest, the least educated, and those with the lowest household income. That is a problem if you're trying to sell Mercedes cars, for instance, to a highly affluent audience. Clearly, that isn't necessarily the audience that you're looking for. There's another study that I particularly like where this company looked at 98 brands, and what they did was they said, what is the demographic fingerprint, or the DNA, if you will, of all the people who come and convert on our site from whatever method? And they put that to one side and said, okay, this is our demographic, this is our DNA of our audience. They then looked at the DNA of all of those people who responded to the advertising through exposure but not clicking, and there was almost a direct correlation in 97 out of 98 of the cases. But then on the other hand, they looked at all the people who clicked on the advertising, and there was zero correlation between all the clickers across all of these brands against what the standard site audience was. It tells us that the event of clicking is largely random. Now, there is a lot to be said about the quality of creative. There is a lot to be said around if you have targeting that is inaccurate and people who shouldn't be seeing your ad are seeing that ad are not going to click on it anyway. That is absolutely true. But what I like about these studies is that they looked at a broad enough range of brands and ideas and a broad enough slice of the population in order to get an accurate enough read for me to be feeling comfortable talking to you about it today. So it brings us to a different type of argument. We know from things like traditional that advertising clearly can influence people. As we've just said, it didn't work at all. Nobody would do any type of traditional advertising. So obviously it can have influence. But I completely concede that claiming 100% credit for view-through is also significantly inaccurate. Marketers have so many other things in play other than display advertising, and within display advertising itself, we'll be running with many different types of tactics and targeting methodologies. It would be insanely arrogant for me to claim to any client that the only possible thing that drove a conversion for their customer was a banner ad that I showed them for something like search retargeting. It's garbage, right? What we're saying is we influenced these people, but we weren't solely responsible for every conversion that ever took place. And so I completely concede that 100% is inaccurate. But if we accept this and we both give a little, then this is no longer an argument of is view-through or post-impression a valid metric. This is now an argument of, well, how much view-through or how much post-impression is valid. And so that brings us on to some of our other methodologies. And before I quickly move on, if you Google, I have an article out there, if you Google Dax Think and then Winston Churchill, bizarrely, there's an article on there that was a little, shall we say, cheeky to say publicly on the webinar, but if you want to go seek that out, then I think it's a very memorable way to look at this same view-through argument. But let's look at the measurement side. Well, some of you, I can imagine down this phone line, are kind of raising an eyebrow at the mention of PSA. PSA stands for Public Service Announcement. Really, it's just an A/B standard split test. And what it means is we are isolating our audience into two. We have the audience of people that we're exposing to the branded advert, and then we have those people that we're exposing to some completely arbitrary message. Many of you will have seen adverts for Smokey the Bear, you know, that kind of little banner ad that appears that says, hey, be careful of wildfires. If you're seeing that ad, somebody somewhere has you in an A/B control group to measure view-through. That's why we use those sorts of things. For those of you that are on the publisher side, there is the Ad Council site where charities can upload their ads for free, and you can go in and download those and give them some free impressions. But what we're talking about doing here is, let's take an example. Let's say, we mentioned Mercedes earlier, we'll talk about Mercedes. What we do is we divide their audience into two. Doesn't have to be an equal split. We can take that into account later in the measurement. And to part of their audience, we show them the Mercedes branded ad. To the other part of the audience, we show them, let's say, this Smokey the Bear ad. Now, clearly, the Mercedes branded ad can have an influence on that audience and get more people to come to the Mercedes site. Whereas the Smokey the Bear ad is completely arbitrary. It's got no connection to Mercedes. It's not going to influence anybody to come and check out Mercedes or to buy a Mercedes car. And that's the idea behind this split test. What we're doing is we want to look at the ways in which those two halves of audience respond and react after they were exposed. So let me give you another example before we talk through this example. In San Francisco, where I live, in Union Square, there is a Macy's store, and it sits pretty much right in the middle of Union Square. Now you imagine we could seal off Union Square and we couldn't let anybody enter or leave, so we have a controlled environment. And we draw a line right down the middle of Union Square. And I turn to my left, and to half of the audience, I tell them something completely arbitrary. Maybe I tell them, like Smokey the Bear, be careful about wildfires. And then I turn to my right, and I talk to Union Square, and I say, hey, Macy's is over there. They happen to have some really cool clothes. Why don't you go check them out? We then sit and wait and count the number of people that walk into Macy's. the number of people who go to Macy's from the second half, the half that I told that Macy's were there and that they have some cool stuff and this is their values and maybe there's a sale on, people from that half of Union Square are going to go into Macy's more frequently than people who are on the other side of Union Square. Now back to our point about arrogance, I couldn't claim to Macy's that everybody that walked in from the side I talked to only went there because I talked to them. It's Macy's. People know Macy's. Some people are going to go wandering into Macy's anyway. But what I can do is I can say, well, on my control side, 20 people in an hour walked into Macy's. But on the other side, 40 people walked into Macy's. And so what we can say is we created twice the interest in Macy's by exposing them to that advertising. So the study that I'm going to walk you through on the screen here is doing exactly that. In our example in A, section 1, the top left-hand box, but A, the branded client campaign, they were exposed in this case to the retailer's ad. And those people went on and generated $50,000 worth of post-impression revenue. The second group, the non-branded control group, they were shown some pretty mountain range picture. They weren't told anything about the retailer message at all. But they know the retailer, and so some of those people went to go buy anyway and spent $10,000 in revenue. Well, what you're looking at in the second box, mark number 2, in the top right-hand corner, is what we then do with those two numbers. And you can see it's really a straightforward percentage calculation. We're saying that we created an 80% uplift, but from the 10,000 standard amount of revenue to the 50,000 increased amount of revenue. And these slides will be available later for you to kind of look and digest at this, and we can answer questions on this later as well. But if you look down at box number 3 at the bottom now, you can see what this means. So in this particular campaign, let's say we spent $20,000 in display ad campaign, and that generated 5 million impressions. It generated $50,000 in post-impression revenue. You'd think the client would be quite happy with that, but we're not going to count $50,000 of post-impression revenue because we've just learned that 20% of all of that revenue would have occurred anyway from our control group. And so we're going to factor it down from 50 to 40, and it gives us a total amount of revenue of 90. Okay? This is all this PSA A/B split test study does. It sounds terribly complicated, but it's saying how much of your audience would have bought anyway. And we have various articles and white papers available, but I'll give you a link to that in a moment if you want to digest this more. But the important thing to take away is there is a way to benchmark view through. The other method that I'm a fan of is the world of attribution modeling. Attribution modeling says, let's look at every channel we're running and let's look at the percentage of influence each of those channels have. Now, it would be really easy for me to sit here and say, hey, marketer, why don't you go away and do a full attribution study? The trouble is, quite frankly, they're a pain in the butt. They are inherently full of technical integration problems. There is leakage of data all over the place. It's very difficult to get all the systems working together and talking together in order for you to get the right degree of accuracy that you need. But if you can solve at least some of those problems, you then have to look at, well, what attribution model is right for me? We've seen a lot of success with our clients running with people like Odometry, where Odometry is specialists in this area and will help the marketer track all their different channels. And will then help them say, well, Chango, for instance, influenced 30% of all of these people, even though perhaps you attributed it to SEM or direct load on the site. The chart on the screen here is a method that I particularly like. It was done by Forrester. And what they said is, let's look at all of the different touch points. And in this case, it was search and display. And they said, well, we're going to factor in two things. How many times did somebody interact with each of those channels? And at what point in the funnel did each channel occur? The further back in the funnel, the less weight it should get. The closer to the point of conversion, the more weight it should get. And you can download this Forrester research report if you Google for it and read more about it. There are many different attribution models out there. This is simply one method. It's certainly favorable over something like a last click or a last touch model that ignores all the influence that's occurred before, but it's a good starting point. So now we've kind of looked at the measurement. What do some of the results look like? Well, I've got two examples from you. I went into our dashboard and looked at a couple of our clients. First of all, I want to give you an example of a very large, very well-known brand retailer that we work with. they did this PSA studies with us to benchmark the performance of each of the things that they were running. Now, the mistake a lot of marketers make is they say, we're going to do this study once, and that's our gospel number, and we're going to apply that to everything we run. Yeah, that's garbage. Everything performs very differently, and in fact, we typically think about this in breaking down into 3 buckets. First of all, you have prospecting for brand new customers. This is exposing people who have never seen your ads before. Second is we have the site retargeting that is speaking to everybody who has visited your site but who has not yet converted. And the third bucket for a PSA test is everybody who has visited your site and is an existing customer. Now, we know the intent of all of those people are completely different, and so why wouldn't you do this benchmark for each of those different groups? The 27% was for search retargeting, prospecting for brand new customers for this major brand. What that means is, out of all of the view-through conversions that took place, 20% could be considered to have incrementally been driven from the search retargeting program that we were running. The other 73% would have occurred anyway, whether the people were exposed or not. Secondly, for our site retargeting to existing prospects or visitors, well, these people have already been to the site, and so at a greater rate are more likely to come back and convert anyway, and you find from the study that the number came down dramatically to about 50% of our previous, to 13% being valid incremental uplift. And finally, you have those people who are existing customers. This particular large brand retailer has the type of products that people would perhaps come back and buy from at least once a quarter and often once or more a month. And so if they're an existing customer, showing them the ads is going to make very little difference. 92% of them were going to come back and buy again anyway, and so 8% was the incremental number. Now, let's flip that over to a very different type of brand, a small, unknown travel brand. And what I mean by unknown is they were brand new. Nobody had ever heard of them. They had very little other marketing out in the market. There was no way for people to already know who they were. This wasn't Macy's on Union Square, for instance. This happened to be some brand that people just didn't know. When we ran their PSA studies, we found that 93% of all the conversions could be demonstrated to be incremental from post-impression. Only 7% had ever heard of these people and were going to come and buy anyway. We then found, similar to the last study, that the step down continues. So site retargeting to the existing visitors. In this case, they needed pushing over the edge. These prospects had no brand loyalty or understanding of the value of this brand, and so it was about 70% it netted out at, and you can see 24% for the existing customers. So let's flip between those two. The large brand, the right number for prospecting was about 27%. The right number for site retargeting was between 13 and 8, depending on the type of retargeting we're talking about. And then our smaller unknown brand, 93% was proved to be incremental, with 70 and 24 for the different types of site retargeting. Now, site retargeting brings me onto this other topic that I'm extremely passionate about, which is that site retargeting is fundamentally broken. Marketers never cease to amaze me in some of the ways that they look at site retargeting. Site retargeting started off as the way to fix what was broken. Somebody came to your site and they left without converting. Typically that was because they didn't get the information they wanted, they weren't quite certain as to whether you were the person they wanted to buy from, maybe there was a technical issue, maybe they couldn't complete the process, whatever it might be. Site retargeting was to plug that leak that you had in your funnel from people not doing what you wanted them to do. Yet somehow marketers got on this crazy high and see site retargeting as the be-all and end-all to everything. The number of marketers that I speak to and they say to us, we want to increase our site retargeting spend. And I ask them why, and they say, well, it's got such a high ROI. Yeah, it doesn't. Site retargeting, you have to factor in the original cost of bringing people to the site, whether it be through display or search. And then you restate those numbers and you look to see how effective it is. And interestingly, I wrote a piece recently. There's a friendly bit.ly link for you to find it here on iMedia Connection on this exact subject of why retargeting is fundamentally broken. Site retargeting should be benchmarked for view-through or post-impression and measured in a completely different way to something that is out there prospecting for you. And this is coming from a guy who, our company offers site retargeting. I believe in site retargeting, but I believe it's over-invested in and people are measuring it incorrectly. So my encouragement is to look at the way you're doing that measurement before continuing to invest in it so heavily. The other problem that site retargeting generates is that By its nature, it is there to get last touch or last click. Someone comes over to your site, they look around, they browse, they leave without completing the action. Site retargeting is meant to be there to keep grabbing them back and bringing them back to your site to hit the conversion point. It's meant to get last touch and last click. It's like you having somebody stood at the doorway of a store. Someone comes into your physical store off the high street, walks around, leaves, and then there's somebody at the door quickly standing there saying, hey, you know, why are you leaving? Why don't you come back in and just check out these other things that perhaps you missed? You couldn't give credit for the sale to every sale to the person stood at the door. The person was in your store already. And so the problem with site retargeting is that it often claims that last click and last touch and hides all of your mid and upper funnel display media buys. And again, to loop it back to the beginning, causes marketers to make silly decisions. Within this article on iMedia Connection, there's a recommendation I have about a completely different way to measure site retargeting that some of you might find interesting. So we promised you this was a mini webinar. We're about at the halfway point. We've had a number of questions come in, and so I'm going to start dealing with those. Bottom left-hand corner of your chat function, you will see the option to ask us questions, and so please do feel free to do so. After the webinar, you'll also be sent a link to both the recording and to the presentation on SlideShare. And of course, we do recommend chango.com/resources. On there you will find one of our papers, View Through Attribution Exposed. I promise it is useless for insomniacs. We get a lot of good feedback on it, and people say that it has some interesting stuff, and will be a good recap of a lot of the things we're dealing for you here. So if I look at some of the questions, first of all, let's have a look. There were a lot at the beginning about the background noise. Let me scroll through those. A comment here from Melissa. I believe when we were talking about the arguments against view-through and why marketers are skeptical, Melissa writes the comment that CPA models encourage it. This is absolutely true, and I'm glad you raised it, Melissa. One of the problems is that a lot of display media planners think that they're doing their client or their own organization a favor by buying on a CPA basis. There is occasion when that is right, but if somebody is taking the risk, which is what they're doing when they're selling to you on a CPA basis, they want compensating for risk. And so you lose efficiency because of the risk that they're taking on your behalf. And if they're also measuring on a CPA, they will often have terms that says they're using their data. Well, if they're using their data, it encourages the fraud and the cookie stuffing that we referenced before. And of course, that is a problem. Great question from Stephanie. How do you track the post impression? How do you know that someone saw your ad and then went to your website? Great question, Stephanie. So what we're talking about here is that when someone is exposed to an ad, where, let's say, for search retargeting by Chango, we drop a cookie on their computer, the Chango cookie, and it's got an anonymous ID number in it. And when they then, and we know that they saw the ad and which ad they saw and exactly when they saw it. When that person then comes to the retailer's site, if that's our example, and converts, our code sits on that client's retail site and says, does this person have a Chango ID on it? If it does, we look it up in the database and say, oh, great, we showed them an ad 3 hours ago. That means, therefore, we can attribute that sale to the ad. So hopefully that addresses that one for you. Another good question from Melissa. Is this online sales only? For the example we're talking about here, yes. But this idea of the PSA or the A/B split test exists in the traditional world as well. You will often get marketers when they're doing TV advertising who will do holdout groups. They'll run a national campaign, but they'll isolate certain DMAs where the ad doesn't show. And they will look at the incremental difference between the market in which the ad was seen and the market in which the ad was not seen. And for those of you who travel around the country for work or for other reasons, you'll often see that there are certain ads, if you start to look, that you get exposed to in certain areas and certain ads for big national brands that you'd expect to see, but you don't. And that's often because there are these holdout groups in action, or they're trying to do this type of testing and incrementality. And there are many ways of which you can do this. There's also the idea of a study that's called unaided brand recall. Sometimes some of you will have been served surveys by companies like Vizu, for instance, where you look at a banner ad and then it tries to fire you some survey questions and says, can you name a credit card brand that you've heard of, or give you a list of 5 and ask you to say which ones you know. And then about 30 days later, you'll get the exact same study. Well, That's what they're trying to do. They're trying to say, was the exposure to the campaign, has it changed your behavior and made you conscious of the fact that this brand of credit card now exists? I hope I'm pronouncing this name correctly. Ara, I think it is, or Ara. Apologies if that's not right. How do you assess if the post-view attribution window should be less than 14 days? There are a number of studies for it, but quite frankly, you probably already have the data within your organization. You'll probably have a certain amount of information as to what the typical consideration cycle is for somebody. Again, to use the example, if you're selling mortgages, you know it's probably 15 to 90 days for someone to have to go through the consideration process. If you're selling DVDs, it's probably a day, maybe 2 days. If you're selling clothing, fashion, etc., it might be a week, it might be 14 days. Really, that's the best place to start. Dashboards like ours also give you interesting reporting around exposure to conversion, is the name of the report that can also give you some indication on that. Question from Tyson is 80% a realistic benchmark to use, or is that just an easy example? Wondering what advertisers typically find as an average percentage lift. Certainly not 0% and certainly not 100%. After that, it really comes down to the brand and all of the circumstances that each one has. I would say that if you're getting started in view-through and you haven't yet done these studies and so on, I'd say 50 to 80% is a good starting window, and then you run these studies and then you see what the results are. Interestingly, we were just doing a training session for some new starters at Chango this morning, and the similar question came up, and they were asking about the accuracy of such a study. The reason why I said when I pulled up the PSA slide that I can imagine people down the phone rolling their eyes is because a PSA does have its problems. Cookie deletion is an issue, for instance, but you have to start somewhere. Consider it, Tyson, to be a triangulation project. You shouldn't just run this once, you should run it a number of times. For instance, on our campaigns, running in the background on every campaign is a 4% A/B split test that allows us to continuously check and verify this data. That kind of approach is the way you want to do this. You want to look at it in each quarter. Your view-through impact is going to be different in Q2 rather than Q4, for instance. Do it a number of times and see what happens. Garrett, how are you handling or accommodating for multiple devices? Great question. It's very, very difficult to solve, and it is one of the problems with doing any type of holdout group like this, particularly if someone is using an Apple device on iOS and cookie tracking is a problem. There's no great solution for it. Companies like Odometry that we've seen our clients use, there are others out there, have certain methods for trying to help this, but it's something that you're never going to get 100% clean read on, and it is an issue. But you must consider these studies to be indicative, not some definitive answer of 42. So another question here, is the A/B test all you need to figure out the view-through attribution percentage, or does Chango also look at how much the brand does TV, radio, print in their budget too? That is an interesting question. I would say it depends on the circumstance. I want to give you a more detailed answer than that, but it does depend on the circumstance. In an ideal world, in the period when you're doing the A/B split test, it should be as clean as possible. And so you want the same amount of background noise from other marketing channels to be appearing to both the control group and to the brand exposed group. And that will help you get some sort of read. Sometimes I'll sit down with a marketer and look through all of their marketing plans and understand what's happened over the last 90 days and what they're planning to do over the forward 90 days. But again, because certain things can happen, I mean, you might have no other advertising running and, Oprah suddenly decides to feature you on a TV show and suddenly your book goes through the roof. Well, that's nothing to do with advertising you bought. It's a completely different factor, and it's outside of your control. And so doing these more than once and constantly triangulating the result is the methodology. Question here again, I hope I'm pronouncing this correctly, from Jacoba. Are all retargeting companies using the last click attribution model? No, very much not, actually. A lot of site retargeting companies, and I want to be clear about the distinction. When people say retargeting, they often mean site retargeting, but there's lots of other types of retargeting, such as search retargeting, for instance, which is prospecting. When we're talking about site retargeting, then it's very much in the interest of all those companies who are in display to try and educate their customers about the world of view-through, and they should be helping you do these studies to understand which conversions they influence. Now, there are some that operate on a kind of hybrid post-click model, which I don't have a lot of faith in. What sometimes is called a click isn't necessarily what the rest of us would call a click. And in those particular circumstances, they very much support the idea of last click or last touch because that's what they're motivated to do. There's no right answer to it. It's a mix of what's out there. What I would say is last touch, like the example we gave of the shopkeeper standing at his door, grabbing people as they're walking out and bringing them back in, that person shouldn't get credit for all the sale, and it's hiding all of the other marketing you did in order to get the people there in the first place. And it's the same thing. Last click, last touch will hide all of the other marketing spends that you did and cause marketers to make inaccurate decisions. So it looks like that is all of our questions that have come in so far. My contact details are on this final slide, dax@chango.com. Follow us at Chango on Twitter, comebychango.com/resources. Particularly recommend the view-through white paper. Feel free to reach out with thoughts, comments, questions, requests, criticisms, whatever you might like to send us. You will also be sent a link to this recording, and you'll be sent a link to the SlideShare presentation. Our next webinar will be in about 30 days' time. Look at chango.com/resources in order to get that next webinar information. Thank you very much to all of you for joining us. We appreciate it and appreciate your time, and hopefully we will see you again soon on our next webinar.
Thank you. Please stand by.